Despite what a couple people thought when I first announced this video's title, this is not about Spider-Man fighting a terminally ill patient. That wouldn't be the worst thing he's done, but no, cancer isn't something that he can just beat up and call it a day like it's the Vulture. He has to approach it differently, without relying on a punch or a wisecrack, and that's led to some of the most heartfelt, devastatingly human stories in any comic book. One of the best examples of this is The Kid Who Collects Spider-Man, a story written by Roger Stern back in the 80s. The story begins with a boy called Tim Harrison, Spider-Man's #1 fan. He's got all the Spider-Man toys, he's got recordings of Spider-Man on TV, and even has these huge scrapbooks of all the Daily Bugle articles that Spider-Man's in. In fact, he's so obsessed that the Bugle itself picks up on it and publishes an article about him. Spider-Man sees this article and decides to surprise Tim with a visit. Tim can't believe his eyes, he must be dreaming, but Spider-Man soon convinces him otherwise. Tim proudly shows off all of the scrapbooks and memorabilia, and the two go through all the newspapers together, laughing about how much of a dick J. Jonah Jameson is. Tim has all sorts of questions to ask him, were you born stuck to a wall? How do your webs work? That sort of thing. Spider-Man tells the story of how he was bitten by a radioactive spider and all the amazing gifts that it gave him. He's more than happy to explain how his web shooters work, and lets Tim mess around with them for a bit. He also lets Tim know about his spider sense, something which only Spider-Man himself really knew about at the time. Tim asks another question, which Spider-Man is slightly less inclined to answer. Tim's a superfan, he's got all the articles way back to Spider-Man's first appearance, so he knows that Spider-Man was briefly an entertainer, performing tricks on TV. So what was it that made him give up fame and fortune to pursue a thankless career fighting criminals? Spider-Man describes the death of Uncle Ben and how it shaped him as a person, but he keeps it vague enough so that it doesn't give away his secret identity. And although the conversation gets a little bit depressing, Spider-Man makes sure to lighten the mood and focus more on Tim, asking about his collection. Eventually, it's time for Spider-Man to leave. It's way past Tim's bedtime, and crime isn't going to fight itself. But before he leaves, Tim has one final question. He wants to know who Spider-Man really is. Spider-Man explains that he can't just give up his secret identity, because people would get hurt and all that. Even though Tim promises not to tell another soul, he just can't do it. And right as he's about to leave for good, Peter has a change of heart and takes off his mask. Tim is ecstatic and laughs about how Peter's been taking photos of himself the whole time. When Peter insists that he can't tell anyone, Tim promises him that it's their secret. Peter tells him to take care of himself and swings out into the night. Just as he's out of view, Peter stops around the corner and breaks down into tears. The last panel is an excerpt from the article about Tim, revealing that Tim has leukemia, and that his last wish before he dies was to speak to his hero. While Tim's condition was terminal, the ending was left open for a good number of years, until one of Marvel's annual Christmas specials, in which Tim's brother confirms that Tim had died. He says that Spider-Man's visit really meant the world to him, and that he died happy having become best friends with his hero. Tim would be brought up again over 20 years later, appearing in one of Peter's dreams as he's haunted by all the people he's lost. He shows up again a few issues later when Peter suffers a cardiac arrest and experiences a vision of the afterlife. This vision of Tim, alongside many other loved ones, serves as motivation for Peter to get back up and keep fighting. Despite being one of the most cherished and impactful Spider-Man stories, it was originally a backup story. The ones where the editor's like, oh fuck, even I can't stretch this story to 25 pages, alright, just throw in something about a coffee shop. But it's weird because a lot of these backup stories end up being really special, and that also includes Leah. What makes this particular story both impressive and equally emotional is that the majority of it has no dialogue. It relies on pure visual storytelling. Leah tells the story of a sick homeless girl who falls in love with Spider-Man. Just like Tim, she collects lots of newspaper clippings, only this time she's doing it to keep herself warm at night. One day, Leah wakes up to see Spider-Man right in front of her. She's over the moon, and the two go swinging through the city together. It's a happy, wholesome time, until the last page reveals that Spider-Man wasn't just taking her out for a fun swing. Instead, he had found her unconscious in an alleyway and was rushing her to the hospital. Leah had never actually woken up from her dream, and was hallucinating as all of her organs were failing. Sadly, there's nothing the doctors can do, and Spider-Man blames himself for not discovering her sooner. Spider-Man kisses her on the cheek, and she drifts off dreaming of her favourite heroes. Unlike Tim, Leah was never brought back, but the two stories themselves are very similar. They both withhold information and then hit you with a gut punch in the last couple panels, so that when you go back and read it again, not only does it make more sense, but it also makes everything way more impactful. One of the keys to a good story is giving you incentive to experience it again, and if you're gonna do a twist at the end, make sure it's deeply rooted in everything that came before it, so that the reader feels like an idiot for not realising it in the first place. The ending of Tim's story is so impactful because it uses the newspaper clippings that were so prominent throughout the issue. Suddenly the lines, "as long as I lived," or "buddies till the end," have a whole other meaning to them, which explains Peter's solemn expression when he hears those words. Tim's enthusiasm and positivity is no longer just a sign of a happy-go-lucky kid, instead it's a sign of his bravery in the face of leukemia. Leah's story does the same thing, only without words, and you feel stupid for not spotting the angelic, heaven-like imagery. Also, this panel where Leah watches Spider-Man fight the Vulture is probably one of the saddest pieces of art I've ever seen. How she's right down at the bottom of the panel, taking up barely any space, like she's small and insignificant, buried in the grey slums of New York while the colourful heroes proudly fight in the sky. She's reaching up, wanting to join them, but even though there are only a few stories between them, they couldn't be further apart, because not everyone can be bitten by a radioactive spider, or have loved ones who care for them, or even a warm bed at night. And despite all of this, she still smiles and is happy for what she has. It's even more heartbreaking when you realise that, in a way, Spider-Man failed to save her twice. Not only wasn't he fast enough to arrive at the hospital, but all the pictures of him that made up her blanket weren't enough to save her from freezing. This formula of withholding information was also used in the final story I want to look at. It's one of my favourite Spider-Man stories, and it's slightly less depressing. Spider-Bite by Tom Taylor explores the adventures of Spider-Man and his new plucky assistant. Dr. Octopus has won, Spider-Man is powerless to stop him, and New York is seconds from ruin. Octavius has a mysterious device known only as the Box, a device of unlimited power and strength, but not so fast. Suddenly, Spider-Man's trusty sidekick Spider-Bite shows up and starts kicking the shit out of him. Octavius is humiliated, and Vulture swoops in to make their escape. But they're still victorious. The box is still theirs. Seriously, what is this box, man? But it's not too late to stop them. With the power of friendship, self-belief, and iconic imagery, Spider-Bite helps free Spider-Man and they swing off to go save the day. So far, we got a number of questions. What's up with the dialogue? Why would Spider-Man allow this small child to risk his life against murderous criminals? What is the box? These questions slowly start to unravel as the story goes on. Spider-Bite says the box contains the heart of New York, and refuses to elaborate. It's not long before the two heroes are confronted by the villains, and they come face to face with the sinister 60. And yes, there is actually 60 of them, all of which are legitimate Spider-Man villains that have appeared at one point or another. They were kind of running out towards the 50 mark, like Demo Goblin, remember that fucking classic? Spider-Man and Spider-Bite work together to systematically take down each of the villains one by one. And if you look closely, you can see Mephisto emerging from the shadows, about to try and make a deal, only for Spider-Bite to punch him in the fucking head. After all of the villains are beaten, it's time to reveal the true mastermind behind this whole operation. Stiltman. It's Stiltman. And he's taken out 5 seconds later when they do a 80-80 on him and the box is returned to its rightful hands. This whole time they were chasing a Spider-Man action figure, because he is the heart of the city, and for a 9-year-old, of course that's going to be the most important prized possession they can think of. Spider-Bite takes off his mask, and in case it wasn't obvious, the whole thing was make-believe. Spider-Bite's real name is Nathan, with his family, friends, doctors and nurses pretending to be villains, the only real element being Spider-Man himself. When it's time for Spider-Man to leave, Nathan gets overly emotional and screams in Spider-Man's face. This is not from being ungrateful, it's just that if Spider-Man leaves, he'll have to go to bed. And while bedtime is a common enemy for any child, for Nathan it's not just a fear of bad dreams or missing out on fun. He's scared because if he goes to bed, he might not get back up again. This could easily have ended here, the last image for the reader being this heart-wrenching panel which says far more than any speech bubble ever could. But it's Spider-Man. He'll go out of his way and drop everything at the sight of a single crying child. And so he asks if Nathan has a jacket, or something to keep him warm. What for? Well, maybe his dreams don't have to be make-believe, and so instead of ending on that somber image, we're left with this. All of these stories don't have an inherent narrative link. They were written years apart by different people, but fortunately you as a reader can interpret them however you want. My personal take is that these stories are in fact connected. Spider-Man regretted leaving Tim's visit on such a sad note, and so he made sure not to do the same thing with Nathan. Spider-Man saw how much he meant to Leah, saw how she was dreaming of him, and vowed that he would never let another child's dreams stay make-believe. And stories like Nathan's, like Tim's, like Leah's, all raise the same question. They all take place in the main comics universe, right? Earth 616, home to gods, miracles, mystic beings, many of whom Spider-Man is on good terms with. So why can't he just get them to help out? Hey, Doctor Strange, instead of casting a spell to forget Spider-Man's identity, how about you cure cancer, you selfish dick? This has been a talking point for years. In the famous 9/11 issue of Amazing Spider-Man, you could of course ask why a couple of terrorists could take down the World Trade Center, when there's probably 1,000 superhumans living within a few blocks. Why are all the villains here crying their eyes out? This is a good thing, guys. You've tried to do way worse. I used to think like this, but by fixating on these plot holes, so to speak, I was kind of ignoring these stories' intentions. Stan Lee said it himself. The Marvel Universe takes place in the real world, because Marvel have always reflected the experiences and problems that we ourselves go through. So you could say that the purpose of Marvel Comics is to make people feel better, feel seen and understood, whether it be an individual or a large community of people. That 9/11 issue was read by first responders, by traumatized civilians, only days after the attack, and it brought them some comfort, some sense of what had happened. Logic doesn't hold a candle to the emotional impact these stories can have. Another thing I used to think was that these stories were exploiting the cruelty of life for a cheap tug on the heartstrings. After all, what's sadder than a sick child who's scared he won't get out of bed in the morning? People are gonna cry at that. And if a product gets a strong emotional response from you, psychologically you'll want to return to that product or something similar. That's just how it works in any media. First rule of editing a movie, emotion. How does your edit evoke emotion from the viewer? Because that's the thing they're going to remember. But in thinking this, I missed another key part of these stories. While they do deal with very depressing subjects, the stories themselves aren't all miserable in tone. In fact, they're the opposite. These endings are filled with bittersweet images of hope, resilience, and love in the face of tragedy. Even when Tim's story ends on a bleaker note, most of the issue is dedicated to a light-hearted conversation with a very brave, enthusiastic kid who's just fulfilled his life's wish. These types of stories are core to Spider-Man as a character. Spider-Man is the poster child for what Marvel Comics does. He suffers the same things as us, but these problems are just one side of a coin. Yes, a large part of Peter's life is dictated by luck, whether it be his economic background, the things that happen to his loved ones, or just pure dumb coincidences. Gwen Stacy just happens to be in Peter's apartment when the Green Goblin comes knocking. It is for this reason that she dies and completely alters the course of Peter's life. Aunt May just happens to get sick, which leads to Peter having to give up his blood, which leads to a whole bunch of problems down the line. But whatever Peter lacks in terms of luck, he makes up for it with action. Gwen's death is tragic, but he still perseveres. He continues to be a hero and spends a countless amount of time practicing so that he'll never make that mistake again. Even though there's no conceivable chance that he'll escape and rescue his aunt, he still succeeds through sheer willpower alone. Because no matter what, Spider-Man always gets back up. It's this character versus chance balance that translates to these types of stories, because some people don't get any chances in life. You have these kids who have a life of infinite potential and yet it's hindered or cut short. And for what? Nothing. It's completely out of their control. Kids in these situations look up to Spider-Man because he's the embodiment of making the most of a bad situation. He shows them brightness in the darkest of moments because that's who he is. And that humanity, that compassion and hope that makes up the very idea of Spider-Man is way more powerful than any cancer or condition could ever dream of. This would usually be the part in the video where I do a fun song or something that takes the piss out of whatever I was talking about, but given the subject, it'd be a little bit too in poor taste. Besides, if I made a diss track on cancer, it'd probably clap back by killing another one of my family, so... If you are dealing with these situations, it fucking sucks, but I hope this video brought you something that wasn't totally miserable, and if not, I hope you enjoyed the sound of my nasally, slightly toned down Scottish accent. Peace.
Let's sing a song on the way back home, you and me, shooting holes at the moon, you and me, shooting holes at the moon.